Fantastic. I think that's our cue to start going. So good morning, everyone. From the Yes on 2 team and our special guest today, Peter Brann. I like to start out here by saying by giving a little bit of an explanation as to what ballot measure 2 does. First and foremost, our goal is to return the power, voice, and choice back to our votes, back to Alaska's voters. And we're going to do that in 3 separate propositions that really work together. You can't have one without the other. The table won't stand. And what those are first, we're going to do away with the two-party primary, where we have 2 closed primaries. We actively shut nonpartisan and undeclared voters out. We're doing away with that system and going to an open, nonpartisan top 4 open primary. Second, instituting what's called ranked choice voting in the general election, which we'll be talking about today, talking about how it's been implemented in the state of Maine. RCV was implemented in the state of Maine in 2016 by People's Ballot Initiative, and it's been a great showing of how successful such a free market election system can work, like ranked choice voting. And then finally, what ballot measure 2 does is shines a light on dark money funders, all those funds that come and pour into our state during election years that we don't know where they come from. We as Alaskans, we as voters, we as Americans have a right to know where funding is coming from that goes towards influencing our votes. And so what ballot measure 2 does, really simply, open our primaries to all voters, levels the playing field in terms of candidates and voters, regardless of partisanship. It institutes ranked choice voting in the general election, and it prohibits dark money from flooding into our state from the outside. And so without further ado, I want to introduce our co-host today, Bruce Botelho, who served 4 terms as mayor of Juneau, Alaska's capital city. Having served as Alaska's Attorney General under 2 governors, he has served on numerous local, state, regional, and national boards and commissions. Mr. Botelho received both his undergraduate and law degrees from Willamette University in Salem, Oregon, and completed a 2nd undergraduate degree in German philosophy at the university in Heidelberg, Germany. So without further ado, I'll let Mr. Botelho take it from here.
Thank you very much, Chris. I have in turn the pleasure of introducing our special guest today from Maine, Peter Brann. Peter is a visiting lecturer in law at both Harvard and Yale Law Schools, and is a partner in the law firm Brand and Isaacson. He's a former solicitor, or what we in most states would call Solicitor General for the state of Maine. And that meant overseeing all the appellate cases for the state of Maine in both federal and state courts. During the course of his career, Peter has argued cases in front of the Supreme Court and in 3/4 of the courts of appeal in the federal circuit system, as well as some 20 different states. Probably most relevant to our discussion today, he was counsel to the winning candidate in litigation involving the first congressional election in Maine, which used ranked choice voting. He received his doctorate in laws from Boston University School of Law and holds a BA from Bates College. Peter, it's a delight to welcome you here. We're on the opposite ends of the country, but we have a lot of things that we share in common, as we've discovered during the course of all this. Let me also mention, for those of you who are participating in this webinar or on Facebook, but particularly on the webinar itself, to feel free to make use of the chat box or the equivalent on Facebook to pose any questions during the course of Peter's presentation. We will, towards the end, have an opportunity to answer those questions with Peter. And what we're hoping here to begin with is a brief presentation by Peter. I will be interrupting occasionally, and he and I will talk through the Maine experience with ranked choice voting. Peter, I turn it to you.
Thank you very much. As someone who does teach on the side, I do want to say that I hope people do put up questions, and Bruce does cut me off. There's nothing worse than listening to someone drone on, listening to their own voice forever and ever. What I'd like to do is just give you a 30,000 foot level of how Maine came to have ranked choice voting, and then the back and forth on some of the fights over ranked choice voting. And then we can go to kind of the mechanics of how it works, at least in Maine, which may very well be different than what you might do. So I know that Alaska has a big tradition of having independent candidates, but Maine, like Alaska, really does have quite a tradition in that regard. And just to give you a few factoids here to kind of set the stage. Since 1974, there have been 3 independent candidates who've won for governor in Maine. The current senator who's won twice, is an independent, although he caucuses for the Democrats, but he defeated a Democratic candidate to get there. In every election since 1974, the margin of victory, even when the independents didn't win, was within the range of error, if you will, of the independents, so that the Democratic governor who won in 2018 with over 50% was the first non-incumbent to get over 50% of the vote since 1966. So there's really quite a tradition of independent voters in Maine, which led to efforts that first went to the legislature for a while to try and get ranked choice voting. And it went again and again and never passed. And so finally,
Peter, had there been any experiences at the local government level in Maine with ranked choice voting to begin with? How did people alight on the idea of it in the first place?
I don't believe there were any that had passed. Although there may have been one or two local elections. I think it was people, scrounging around looking for alternatives. As you know from working on the campaign, it has existed in other parts of the country, particularly on the local level. It's been used in Cambridge, Massachusetts, for some period of time, and people were aware of it. But it was only eventually that the people went to try and get it passed through the public referendum process. We have the initiative process here, and it was passed in 2016 by the voters, and immediately ran into a buzzsaw of different types of litigation. And just to summarize, but the only one that mattered was that there was in Maine, you can get an opinion of the justices to ask questions about how something might work. And they ruled that you could not use it because of the Maine Constitution for the general elections for certain state officers. And that's the only time that ranked choice voting has ever been invalidated in any way, not just in Maine, but across the country. There have been a number of cases in lots of different places, including Massachusetts, Minnesota, out in the Ninth Circuit, which is where you all are, that said it's okay. And so, with that exception, it's been validated again and again.
So, having touched on that, could you talk a little bit about the kinds of arguments that were advanced in terms of challenging ranked choice voting? Because the issue may well arise here as well.
Sure.
And in fact, some people have claimed that ranked choice voting is unconstitutional, either federally or under the state constitution.
Yeah. Those arguments have been made a number of times, and every single time the federal constitutional claims have failed. The most prominent ones that you hear about are, this is some sort of a violation of the Equal Protection Clause, that some votes aren't being counted the same. It's, not one person, one vote. The courts have rejected that, and they did in the case that I handled, which was decided based on ranked choice voting for the congressional race in 2018. And the judge there rejected that out of hand on the grounds every vote counts the same. It's just however you choose to vote. You could say, I'm going to rank all of the candidates. I'm not going to rank any of them. I'm going to just, vote for my favorite. You could vote for the, someone who's going to win. You could vote for, your cousin who is going to come in last. It doesn't matter. Your vote counts the same. It's just how you choose to allocate it. So that was a pretty common claim. Another common, and that's been rejected in courts across the country, including the Ninth Circuit. And also you've had another common argument is that it's somehow a violation of the due process. May lead to voter confusion. It's just so confusing, no one can possibly figure it out. And in the case that I handled for the Democrat, that argument was made. They did not show up at a hearing with any voter who was confused, and so, which was fairly striking. It was sort of your Sherlock Holmes, the dog who failed to bark. There's no one there who said, "Geez, I couldn't figure out the ballot." But they did bring in an expert. The judge listened to the expert, and the judge concluded that he actually just rejected his testimony out of hand. He thought it was all conjecture and speculation, that he really didn't, he was just trying to correlate numbers to try and make that happen. And that's been the most prominent argument that's been made. It was made, so again, in 2020, it was sort of another lawsuit was brought against the ranked choice voting, and it was, once again, they brought in a different expert, and the judge said, he said it was, his analysis amounted to condescension, trying to correlate how people voted and that they were confused. The point being, people might not be confused at all. You could just decide, as I say, to vote for someone who's not going to win. That doesn't mean you don't understand how it works. So that was rejected out of hand. And to see what happened there, it's, I think, helpful just to have a little step to consider what happened in the 2018 election. So at the same time, they had been approved. There had been a couple lawsuits where the state, the ranked choice voting side prevailed. And then they had, Maine has, it's known as a people's veto provision. So legislature passes something, you don't like it, you get enough signatures, you're allowed to then go forward and try and get it repealed. If you get enough signatures, it means it won't take effect until after you have the vote. So the reason why, and so in the primary election, was going to be conducted in a ranked choice voting, and they also were going to have a vote on whether or not to try and repeal ranked choice voting.
And Peter, just to clarify the timeline. So the initiative passed in 2016. We're in the 2018 election cycle that you're talking about.
Correct. Yep. In 2018. And so the voters were given a chance to repeal ranked choice voting, and rather decisively rejected that effort. So twice it's been to the voters and been rejected. The ranked choice voting folks have, that side has prevailed each time. And it was used in the primary election. And then it was used, the first time a federal election was ever used ranked choice voting was in fall of 2018. And it was sort of, it's exactly what you might expect could happen is, the notion is that you had the person who was the incumbent on the unofficial count was ahead by just a little bit at the end of on election night. There were two other independent candidates, and then when they collected the ballots, and once they finished collecting the ballots and counted those, you eliminate mathematically unable to prevail, and you ask who are their backup choices, and at that point, the Golden, who was in second place after the first round, won. And so he won as a result of ranked choice voting, meaning that a majority of the people who voted had picked him over the incumbent, Bruce Botelho. And it was, as you can imagine, right after that, that led to further litigation in which they had a whole host of arguments as to why it was unconstitutional or illegal. It included that equal protection argument I mentioned before, the due process claim on voter confusion, as well as some others. They had a First Amendment claim, a voting rights claim. They claimed it violated the elections clause and the qualification clause out of the U.S. Constitution.
Peter, was this case brought in state court or federal court?
It was a federal court. And one of the things which I think which is interesting is, although it was brought and the lineup was, the Democrats were on one side and the Republicans on the other, the judge who decided the case was a brand new Trump-appointed judge, a pretty conservative fellow. And he made the point that there's no inherent reason why this should be favor one party or another. But he rejected all of the arguments that were made by the losing candidate. And he went to, he had a full-scale hearing, which we converted into a trial on the merits, and the whole case was over within a month.
And I take it there was no appeal taken from that decision.
Well, they did appeal, but then they dismissed the appeal. It wasn't litigated. So,
one of the issues that we hear about, and it relates to the argument about voter confusion, is a dampening of voter participation, voter turnout. Any observations to compare voter turnout in non-presidential years, that is to say, looking at turnout 2014 compared to 2018 with the implementation of ranked choice voting?
Well, there was significantly more participation. I'm not sure I would attribute it to one or, there was more participation in 2018, but whether that was, I wouldn't attribute that necessarily to the ranked choice voting. What I will say is, when you compare the ranked choice voting to, which is also known as instant runoff voting, to your more traditional runoff elections, there's a fair amount of statistical support that there's a drop-off in the number of people that go vote in the runoff election. And so you didn't have anywhere near those kinds of numbers in terms of people who, didn't select a second person, because you're right there in the voting booth, and then you can say, I want this person first. That one doesn't win. That's my next choice, as opposed to coming back 2 weeks later or a month later or whatever and having to vote again.
Peter, I know you have in your collection a sample ballot.
Yeah,
it's very helpful, I think, for us just to take a look at what one looks like.
Yeah, what I did is I grabbed the ballot that that we're using this year, and so this is what Maine voters will get, assuming that I can maneuver my way through share screen to put it up. We'll see. And so here it is. This is the ballot, if you were to vote this year in Maine, that you would get on the national side. So as you can see, they give you some instructions on the left, and it says basically, you know, you can vote for, you know, identify who you want to go first, second, third. You can basically vote for as many, it says down there, continue until you've ranked as many or as few candidates as you want. And so if you go to, so for example, the presidential election, which is the one everyone's familiar with, if you say, I'm only going to vote for Biden or I'm only going to vote for Trump, you could just put that down as your first choice, and you don't have to have a second or a third or anything else. If you say instead, geez, I'm going to go with that Green independent candidate, Hawkins, and put them down as first, then you could go to your second one. You know, your second choice could be, you know, from the Libertarian Party, Jorgensen, etc. And then you just mark in the little ovals, and they have the same setup for, you know, the hotly contested U.S. Senate race that we're having up here in Maine, and for Congress. And then the way it works in Maine is, as you can see on the bottom, there's always a write-in, and so you could put in, you could have your first choice or your whatever choice as whoever your write-in.
What would be helpful again, Peter, if you could walk through just a little bit the stages. So as I know you're aware, our ballot initiative calls for an open primary. That's not the main approach. And so I'm wondering if you could comment on what leads to ranked choice voting in your general.
And also, Peter, we have a question that ties into this nicely, and it's, does Maine have ranked choice voting without open primaries? And so if you could touch on that as well, that'd be great. Thanks.
Sure. The primary system in Maine is different than what I understand that you have currently. I mean, you do have to register, you know, register into a party to go into the primary. But you could do that on the day, if you're a voter, you can do it on the day of the election. They have it set up so you're not able to switch parties, you know, right before the election. You know, so there's a waiting period, if you will. But you could have, but there would be the same setup of this ballot you see would be, let's say you were, you know, in the Republican primary, you would have seen, okay, the candidates for, you know, State House or U.S. Senate or what have you, would have the same setup with, you know, Smith, Jones, Brown, etc. And then you mark them the same way. They count them the same as I was describing before, and then the winner of that goes forward into the general election. If you wanted to run as a independent, you need to submit a certain number of signatures in advance, and that would just put you on to the general election ballot.
And is, again, the general election ballot for state offices then a plurality? Or does it?
Yeah, for the general election, the state Supreme Court concluded that it had to be, well, they said the language of the state constitution meant that it had to be a plurality. And so what happens is, which is interesting, is that the primary is conducted under this system, the ranked choice voting system. But the general election, you know, let's say there are, you know, 4 people running for state senate, all 4 would be listed, and the person who gets, you know, the most votes wins on the first. You know,
but again, as you've reflected here with respect to federal offices, the general election is also ranked choice.
Right, because if you think about it, the state constitution didn't say anything about primary elections, and it didn't say anything about federal elections, and so that was okay.
And another question from the audience here. The opposition group in Alaska often states that ranked choice voting is so complex that Maine has a 19-page explanation. can you address this and talk about, I've actually looked at that explanation myself, and it seems to use about 24-point font and some really good pictures and explanations, and just, can you talk to, how it's explained to voters from an administrative standpoint and how well that's been explained?
Well, there's information. Do you want me to leave the ballot up? Is that helpful to leave it up, or should I take it down?
You can take it down or leave it up. I leave that up to you and Bruce.
I'll take it down. That way I could much easier see Bruce and know how I'm doing here. But to the explanation that you have on the left of the ballot is really the only thing that you really need to read. They do have some explanation. I'm not sure I've read all of what it is, but there's enough stuff out there. That when you walk in, you're kind of told, and there were complaints in the litigation that, geez, maybe the explanation wasn't good enough or something like that. The judge did not. He obviously didn't buy on that it was that. So I don't think. The concern is that it's way too complex, but I don't think we've really seen that. It hasn't felt that way.
What is your sense in terms of the actual administration of the elections? Were there any reports of undue delays or complexities in terms of the ministerial effort of counting ballots, for example?
Yeah, I think actually it worked a lot better. I mean, to be honest, I thought it worked better than I expected. You figure you're gonna have a new system that, oh boy, this is gonna be tricky and it's gonna get screwed up in some fashion. But they were able, in the primary election and the governor's race, they had to do it on the Democratic side to use the ranked choice voting. So that meant the significance of that is they had to get all the ballots for the entire state. What they do is they collect them afterwards, bring them all to the Secretary of State's office at the Capitol, and then they feed them. And the laborious process is obviously collecting the ballots, bringing them in, and then they load them. And they had a couple of towns, they don't run the whole thing until they get everyone in. And so they had 2 or 3 towns where something kind of got screwed up and they had to go back and get them again from the town, or get a run from computer run from the town in order to do it. And so they didn't actually run the second round until they got them all. But in the primary, my recollection is it took like about 8 days to do all of that. In the general election, it took a little bit longer, but it was definitely within 10 to 14 days. And what it meant was collecting all of them. And it's kind of ironic, it's kind of like the whole hurry up and wait, right? They're collecting them all, feed them all into their computers at the State House, and then they go, okay, we're ready, let's go. And someone hits a button, and out comes the answer. In the same amount of time it does to do your basic Google search.
Peter, you mentioned that there was an effort to try and repeal ranked choice voting. You've now been through, in essence, either 2 or 3 election cycles. That is to say, primary, general, and primary again.
Well, and just to interrupt, there's actually this year, the legislature went in and added the presidential election to be included this year. And then there was an effort to do the people's veto again. And the people who were trying to stop the use of ranked choice voting in the presidential election were not able to collect enough ballots, enough signatures to get it on the ballot. So, which speaks to some of, they may speak to how difficult it is to get something on the ballot, but it also means they weren't able to do it.
Well, that gets directly to getting your sense of general voter satisfaction with the use of ranked choice voting in Maine. I'm also wondering if there are reflections in terms of editorial comments in leading newspapers in Maine for or against ranked choice voting as it's been implemented, or letters to the editor even. Just again, anything that would anecdotally be a temperature check on the electorate.
I think I'd have to say anecdotally that it really is something that people seem to have gotten comfortable with, and that I don't think that there's a real interest or desire to repeal it. I'm sort of obviously I've done election law, I'm a political junkie, so forth. When it first was proposed, I thought, oh, this is only going to appeal to political scientists and political junkies. But so I had my doubts, frankly. But I thought it's worked pretty well, and I think most people are pretty comfortable with it.
Peter, another question from the audience. Can you talk about what constitutes a ballot being spoiled? This person heard the other night that if you don't rank all the candidates, that the ballot is spoiled. And are there other ways a ballot can be spoiled?
It's not true that if you don't rank all the candidates, your vote is spoiled. In fact, the actual people who were litigating the case in the one that I handled on the congressional race, they only voted for the incumbent congressman, and their vote, was all counted. It's so that doesn't nothing about that spoils your ballot. I mean, the real argument that people had before, as you undoubtedly have heard, is the spoiler, if you will. It's a different issue of not being able to. Geez, I'm really not. I better not vote for this person because they're not going to win, and so, and they don't do it. But that does not lead to your vote not being counted. In the most recent litigation, there was yet another attempt to try and stop the ranked choice voting. The plaintiffs in that case had done several different things. One of them ranked everyone. One didn't rank any. One, I can't remember what the third one did, but they all did different things, and all of their votes were counted. So it really is your choose your own adventure when you decide how you want to do it.
Peter, one of the arguments that has come up here is that ranked choice voting basically either diminishes or the most, I guess, extreme of the arguments eviscerates political parties and their role in the election process. What has your experience been, and recognizing obviously that Maine has a different structure, but has the role of the parties been weakened, changed dramatically by the implementation of ranked choice voting, and recognizing that you'd also commented that one of the parties had actually taken a fairly active role in trying to block its implementation?
Yeah, it's one. To my mind, there's really kind of a disconnect between sort of, the feeling of that this is a partisan type issue. I don't think that's true at all. There was an article today, as you probably, for those of you who follow what's going on in the U.S. Senate races, there's a very, very tight race up here between the incumbent Republican senator, Susan Collins, and the Democratic challenger. And Susan Collins was quoted today as saying she thought she might run. She had considered running as an independent instead of running for re-election as a Republican, because she thought she would, that might be a better way to go. And indeed, I've been saying for 2 years that she ended up doing that. She'd be the biggest fan of ranked choice voting because she would be the number 2 choice behind both the Republican and the Democrat. And so it's not an inherently partisan thing. And so I don't think, that has, and it hasn't really played out. I mean, there's no one who believes that there is any less money being spent by the two parties on these two Senate races because you have ranked choice voting. I don't think people can even imagine having more ads than there are on the TV already. So I know that it certainly hasn't diminished it. I mean, and you know, in the congressional race that I worked on, you know, the winner of the case, you know, the two leaders at the end of the day were the Republican and the Democrat. And so it was just a question of who the independent voters candidates second choice was.
Well, and a question I should have asked earlier, are there any significant third-party movements in Maine? Alaska has its Alaska Independence Party, its Libertarians, its Green Party. Are those equivalents be found in Maine as well?
Over the years, the Libertarians and the Green Party have each crossed the necessary threshold. You have to get a certain number of votes for your gubernatorial candidate to be considered an actual party. And so sometimes they've made it, and then sometimes then they fall below the threshold, and then they're not. Although, you know, they can list themselves on the ballot as you know, whatever you want, you know, so that they do that. So you know, it's, and because I'm not as familiar, obviously, with the Alaska situation, I can't speak to how the Greens and the Libertarians compare. But as I said at the outset, there's really a very, very strong sense of people who are not affiliated running in Maine, regardless of their party.
And one other question. I noticed a difference between Alaska's state constitution and Maine's state constitution. Maine's state constitution mentions winning campaigns with quote unquote a plurality of votes, which for the listeners, a plurality versus a majority. A plurality is simply you get more votes than the people running to the right or to the left of you, so you can win an election with 42%. A majority, a true majority, is 50% plus one. Maine's constitution mentions a plurality in the constitution, and Alaska's does not. And Peter, my question to you is if Maine's constitution was like Alaska's in the fact that it never mentioned winning a election with a plurality, what would this have done to the legal arguments of trying to constrain ranked choice voting on state elections and so on and so forth?
I think it would have led to the opposite result. Basically, they felt constrained by the language of the state constitution. Without that language, I think they would have concluded otherwise. I mean, you know, because it ended up as a situation that I don't think either side was very satisfied with, right? That you had some elections are going to be ranked choice voting, some aren't, and the efforts after that court ruling came down, as you might imagine, were on both sides of the table. One said, let's get rid of all of the ranked choice voting, and the other one says, let's amend the Constitution so we have it for everything. And at least at this point, neither one of them has been able to get themselves to the spot where they got that. So you still have this sort of hybrid situation.
Shay, I'll just make one little correction. I don't have the state constitution in front of me, but I believe the one exception is the office of governor is to be selected by the person who achieves the most votes.
Yeah.
We have a plurality provision, but restricted to the governor.
Yes. And so I am not a legal person like both of you are. And I think the conversation comes into the quote from the Alaska state constitution is the person with the greatest amount of votes. Whereas Maine's constitution actually says the word plurality. And so, you know, the person who wins with the greatest amount of votes is different than than plurality, which really states that you simply have to just get more than the other people running.
But one thing which I'm not going to do is weigh in on Alaska constitutional law. I'm not that dumb.
Peter, I notice we have another question. That is, how are the election results announced? Is the first round announcement prior to the second, or is the final result of all the rounds given up front?
That's a real good question. So what you get at the night of the election, each town's allowed to announce their what they have, from the initial count, if you will, which is only going to be who's in first, and that is the unofficial number. The official number only comes after you've fed everything into the computer, and then they push the buttons, and so then the two numbers come out in very quick succession. It's sort of like having twins. You get one and then you get the other right away. So.
Great. And I noticed this question as well. Can you address lack of transparency, particularly as opposed to the transparency of closed partisan nominating processes?
I'm going to need some more explanation to
and
where
perhaps you can have the person who posed that question provide a little more context. And
because I'm not sure I'm not sure where that's going. It's not that I'm trying to dodge it.
No, and I've just asked the person who asked the question to provide a little more context for us. We'll see what happens.
Okay, all right.
And Peter, another question, in the way people campaign, in the way people communicate on ranked choice voting, not on ranked choice voting, but when they're running under an election with ranked choice voting, have you noticed any shifts in how people campaign, their messaging? Is it a little bit less negative? Is it a little bit more positive? Or maybe is it a little bit more matter of fact about the issues?
I know that people have promoted it in part on that might lead to some greater civility. There's still a tremendous number of negative ads that are coming against the major candidates. It's not like, oh geez, everyone's going to be super nice now. But there definitely has been, if you think about the notion behind ranked choice voting, which is you are looking for someone who you're not going to elect someone a majority of the electorate doesn't like. So you don't want to be that person, right? Who you maybe have a very strong core who really do like you, but you have a lot of people who say, I really, really can't stand her or whoever. And so there is a little bit of that. There was also, and I'll go back to my super duper screen share. I've really got this down now. And I want to show in the Senate race, we have the two major candidates. One of them is going to be a U.S. Senator, but the other two I think are fascinating from the perspective of from the ranked choice voting. And so if I could back to, and so what you have here, you have the person who's running to the right of Susan Collins. As you know, she's listed as being one of the more moderate Republicans, along with one of your senators, and so the person running to the right is out here with signs along the side of the road that is saying Trump strong. So it's really tying himself to Trump, which is, I think, kind of interesting. And he says he's a Republican for the U.S. Senate, even though he's running as an independent. So that's a little different. The sign that I find even more fascinating is the next one. This is a woman who's running to the left of the Democrat, and she, she's running to the left, going, Medicare for all, Green New Deal, etc. But if you can see her tagline it's rank Lisa first. This is a straight out play for people to vote, vote for me because you like me. I'm not going to win. And she's actually been quoted numerous times and say she would not have run if it hadn't been for ranked choice voting. Because you can vote, basically, you can vote for me and you're not throwing your vote away. Just vote for me, rank me first, and then presumably, vote for the Democrat number 2. And so it's more to make a statement. So you have seen some changes in some of the campaigning of people saying, to really play on, especially if you're one of the ones who you're not going to win, but you want to get a certain core of your support out there so people can see it. There were also, and we saw that more. I think we've seen it more in primaries, where they're really trying to, geez, I'd like to be, your backup. I know that so-and-so's, you like so-and-so, but rank me number 2 on the hope that they would get through. Those folks haven't won yet, but so you are seeing some slight change. And I would, the theory is, and it might be more true in a primary, where you really want to be an acceptable alternative to at least half the electorate. So, but I can tell you with $100 million coming into Maine, you've not gotten rid of negative ads.
Yeah, I think that takes maybe a decade after it passes. You put the incentive in front of people, in front of candidates to start working on solutions and making sure, incentivizing them to do more positive campaigning. And it takes a few campaigns or elections to figure out, for campaign managers and campaigners and candidates to figure out that maybe this negative campaigning doesn't work as well in ranked choice voting. And so I think my hope is that what it does is puts the incentive in place to help candidates know that more positive campaigning is better for not only the electorate but their campaign. There's a few quantitative studies that have been done across the U.S. Talking about the number of negative campaign messages before and versus after ranked choice voting that actually do have quantitative findings that say, 10% less likely, 10.1% less likely to see a negative campaign ad instead of a positive one, which is really interesting. But it takes time. It takes time for candidates to adapt. It takes time for us as voters to adapt as well, in terms of making sure that we're watching those positive campaign ads and hoping that our candidates work together.
Peter, we've had someone ask whether the implementation of ranked choice voting has led to more people running as candidates. Are you able to make any judgments about that in terms of your primary compared to other years?
If that I haven't seen that, but I haven't been looking to know one way or another. I'm not sure that it is. I do know, for example, as I said, this woman, Lisa Savage, said she would not have run without ranked choice voting. And in the case that we did in the congressional race, one of the 2 candidates, the one who actually finished 3rd, said she would not have run without ranked choice voting. So there are people who say, geez, I can get in here and make a point even if I'm not going to win. But I don't believe that that's really extended down into people running for state legislature, for example. So I don't, overall I'm it certainly hasn't filtered down to that level.
Well, Bruce, unless you have any other questions for our guests today, I think we better let him go. We're coming up on close on the time, and I just want to say I really appreciated the conversation between you two today. It's not every day I get to chat with two of the best legal minds from two different states, so it was really fun. And thanks for letting me be included.
Well, I had
Yeah,
fun.
Peter, again, thank you so much for taking the time to give us some insights on the Maine experience. You've been the model, and I would say for us, we're hoping to be that as well.
Absolutely.
I hope it was helpful. It certainly is interesting.
Yeah, and so for all of the audience, if you need more information, if you need anything, please visit us at alaskansforbetterelections.com. We're ballot measure 2 on the ballot this year, coming up here close, so get out and vote. If you're going to do absentee, do that. If you're going to do early, do that. No matter how you vote, make sure you vote by November 3rd, and make sure that you're out there supporting your causes and doing your civil duty or civic duty. So thank you all for being on. And if you have any questions, reach out to us at info@alaskansforbetterelections.com. We reply to emails and can through and through every time of the day. So thank you all. Thanks everyone. And we will shut it down there.